Hey friends, I'm Otis Gibbs, and this is my buddy Barry Mazor. He's going to try to answer the question, where did country music come from?
After 1919, there was this moment where a lot of working class people had some more expendable cash than they ever had, and Ralph Peer entered this roots music story at about that point, because what he was somebody who tended individual stores and markets and locales around the country, and he could test whether people actually like this stuff in different areas. So OK Records, where he worked, and where the first big hit blues record, Crazy Blues, was going to be made shortly, the second Mamie Smith record. He went down to black barbershops and pool halls and talked to poor, would you buy this stuff if we put it out? And he came back and he said, yes, they would. Short version. So they started to make those records. But even then, so the blues, the race music records, as they called it, in all due respect, started there and kept expanding. First, it was all sort of vaudeville, uptown blues singers. Then they tried a little over here, a little over here. Next thing you know, there's gospel. There's eventually down-home blues. There's quartets. It expands. Nobody still was talking about recording hillbilly music. And this is about how did we get to hillbilly music, because this is how. And somebody wanted to. And the somebody was various people who were already serving those audiences, just like country radio. The Grand Ole Opry started because insurance companies, who, by the way, had also already been selling to black people, finally decided, how do we sell life insurance to hillbillies, basically? And from that, you get the Grand Ole Opry, and you start to get this area of recording also. And they were trying it out. As early as 1923, Peer was in Atlanta, Georgia, to record more black artists, and this idea came up. One of the local guys there said, and who knew no more about hillbilly music than Peer had, by the way, or appreciated it. So Peer's in Atlanta doing a session with black artists, as he's been, blues artists, Lucille Bogan, the dirty blues artist, and he's down there recording, and local record distributor guy says, he was looking for some other idea. There must be something else. This story has been mistold 14 ways to Sunday about who thought of what and how. And again, this is about people jumping to take credit. The fact of the matter is, they said, there's this guy, Fiddlin' John Carson, who plays around town. He'll be scratchy, fiddly. Maybe somebody would go for that. It's different. Nobody's doing that. And the truth is, there again, nobody had. Like with blues, there were semi-operatic singers or New York studio singers, which was the way recording industry started. The same handful of men and women would record all kinds of tunes, hundreds and hundreds of tunes. And some of them were, Turkey in the Straw. But you didn't have somebody who came out of the culture singing the song for people who came out of the culture. And this was the idea at OK. They sold country records, and they called them at first hill country music. That was the term they used, which is closer than other people got. Never was called hillbilly music officially, by the way, for those who think it was. They knew that might not sit well. But they were calling it that. And announced its birth after they had two, Fiddlin' John, and and when they had like two different people doing it, they said, it's born. We announced this is another thing invented by OK Records for you. It's in the record business. Yeah, it turned out there was an appetite. They didn't trust it. Because people have heard a lot of stories about they thought it was awful. Peer thought it was awful. The word they've always heard is, Fiddlin' John's record was pluperfect, awful. Who would do that? No, what he was talking about was the quality of the recording, because it was very hard to record that stuff well in those days. It was still acoustic. They had this whole complicated cuckoo clock kind of thing to keep the speed right on the records. If people saw that TV documentary series American Epic, which I worked on a little, it shows how that all happened in terms of early recording to get it right. They even built one and had people recording on it for it, which was cool. But so they started recording country, and it started to take off. Understand, this is all before the famous Bristol sessions. He recorded Pop Stoneman and Pop Stoneman's recording of the Titanic probably sold close to 1 million records well before the Bristol sessions. In fact, his relation with Pop Stoneman, for one, was one of the reasons that he went to Bristol. He left OK at a certain point with all kinds of disputes, was looking for the next thing. He was recruited by Victor Records exactly because he knew how to go out and find talent, including in the hillbilly area, which they didn't. Victor had had one of the huge original country records. Everybody knows it. It's Vernon Dalhart's The Prisoner song, If I Had the Wings of an Angel. But it was a one-off. Dalhart was an operetta singer. It's like, this was, and it went anyway because people were so hungry to hear this kind of song, and that sold like crazy. It's one of the few million sellers of those days. When we say million sellers, understand that the population of the country was much, much less than in our day. Almost nothing sold like that. 500,000 was a huge number percentage-wise. No one says, did you sell 1 million in Delaware? Well, think of it like that, The population was smaller. So these were huge records. And Pop Stoneman said, well, if you're going out on these expeditions, as they called them, to find talent in where they were. And the point of this was not like, I've now turned into John Lomax and I want to document American music. No, the business was finding hit records. And the fact is, a lot of these talents had no money. They were down-home folks, black and white, and Mexican soon, also Cajun. They would record it, all these. None of them had any money, and they weren't going to travel to New York for an audition. So the point of that was to bring it where they could come in, and maybe you'd find somebody. So Ernst Stoneman, who was already doing quite well and middle class, and they had the suits and the tables and all this from Mr. Pierre, said, "Why don't you try our area?" Near the Virginia, Tennessee border. There's so many people not far from Carolinas. We think they could come in. So that was the origin of choosing Bristol, which was a burgeoning industrial town in those days and had sophisticated newspapers and all of this. And he would go in and scout and he talked to people. And contrary to popular myth, he didn't put an ad in the paper and everybody shows up and then you have the Bristol sessions and it's the big bang of country music and there it is. No, they didn't come at first. I mean, they were recording once again Stoneman and his family, a few other people who had come in. What turned it into what mattered, that big bang thing, he got the local newspaper to come into a session and, casually drops how much money the Stoneman family was now making in the last year. That did it. Incomes, the Carter family had been buying records for years. It not only wasn't invented by them, but they knew all those records. They tried to get somewhere with Brunswick, and nobody wanted to record the Carter family because they didn't see singers that mattered. The record companies thought what mattered was instrumentals. You could dance in your house and sing to them. They didn't get the personality thing. Ralph Peer was all about the right singer with a song that seemed to sell who the person was, and you got the person in your house, not the song. And the person you wanted to see again. And the Carter family was Hearth and Home. And this other guy who came in with Jimmy Rogers and the Entertainers heard about this, came in, and they were something else. So he was recording them both. He recorded the Carter family, including Storms Across the Ocean, which after he talked to AP, came away with a chorus. These old folk songs, these old ballads that were 500 years old, including the ones that was from. Who's Gonna Shoe This Pretty Little Foot was a lot older than America, let alone the Carter family. But he said, that thing you got about the oceans, he said, if there's a chorus, this is what a pop song was. You told a story, that was okay. Stories were always going to be there in country music, right? That's one of the ways we know. Sometimes today it's hard to identify anything else, but they still tell stories. But he said, if you have this chorus, this could be popular music. And that's why you hear the storms are on the ocean and my love to thee. I mean, that, you could say that was the beginning of commercial country music, except this guy wanders in who had heard vaguely about Pierre. He'd also been turned down by everybody, including, by the way, I have a letter. He'd been turned down by RCA Victor, which, but he wandered in here to the Bristol sessions because the guys in his band, the Tenerife Ramblers, lived around there, and one of them was trying to talk his old man into giving him the car. So these were musicians. That's what they were doing in Bristol. Is that one of the Ramblers was trying to get his old man's car to use, and they came in they said that's now those things they'd heard there was going to be this recording thing, so they showed up unasked, and Ralph kind of knew who he was because they had done local radio in North Carolina, and the word had reached them that Bascom Lamar Lunsford, the guy who did "I Wish I Was a Mole in the Ground," was an old friend of Pierre. Pierre published him; those records sold well, and he was a promoter of early old timey music. We call it now. They didn't call it that then. They just called it the music we're making, and none of this had a name, and. Jimmy Rogers never knew he was in country music, let alone the father of it. Nobody asked, nobody cared for decades. Who was the father of country music? Nobody cared till 20 years after he was dead. But and then they figured out it was him. He came in too. He was with this band. It was they had just been cobbled together. It was a total clash because the band was playing old time fiddle breakdowns and that kind of thing. You might know them from the Old Crow Medicine Show things like "Give It to Me, Here to Me," all those songs. That's what they were doing. It's not what he does at all. He was figured out pretty fast. He was kind of a blues singer with a strange yodel, and so. Pierre broke them up on the spot, basically. They were squabbling, they were arguing, and the Carter family was good to go. They knew hundreds of songs. It was clear they could do all kinds of different things. He recorded half a dozen with them. The second day, AP didn't even show up because he was getting a tire fixed or something, and they discovered he didn't do much on the records anyway. So they just went ahead without it, with the other two women, In Rogers' case, he didn't sing a blue yodel that day. He did Treasures Untold and Sleep Baby Sleep, which had a yodel in it. But the people had been recording that, including Ralph Pierre, since the 1890s. That was not new. That was a vaudeville gimmick. Jimmy wasn't ready on his own because he was singing blues, and this was now important. He sang blues like live blues singers did, not like recording artists did. So you need a beginning, a middle, and the end, and one record has to be different from another. If you're doing live blues, you just throw on some verse. Maybe you made it up. Probably you copied it from somewhere else. That's what blues singers do. Here's a verse that works. You get in a rhythm, and that you just keep going till they stop dancing. But that's not the way records work. So a few months later, Jimmy came back unasked. The records were just coming. He hadn't sold that much. He shows up at Pierre's offices in New York, and then Victor said, "I'm ready for my next record, Mr. Pierre." And he knew this guy was not well. Jimmy was practically homeless. When he was at Bristol, his wife was like staying in a hotel down there because they had no permanent home. And the money came in. He said he felt bad for him. He thought there was something there. It was the gall. It was the sheer gall in doing this. And at the next section, they record T for Texas in Camden, which is where Victor records were made. And that sells close to 1 million copies. And Jimmy Rogers is a star. And between all of these things, the explosion was the reaction to Jimmy Rogers and the Carter family. And from there, it's what else can you do? The band that came to be called Al Hopkins Hillbillies, they had no band name. And they were recording with Pierre. But they had a piano. You could put a piano in a country record? Well, why the heck not? Let's see what that sounds like. And we got no name. He said, "We're just a bunch of hillbillies in North Carolina." I said, "That's what you'll be called." So that's how they came to be called, the hillbillies. We need a name. Record by record and piece by piece, what country music would be was expanded as a commercial experiment to see what you could do. And he said yes to Bill Monroe. and that kind of way. He said yes to Bob Wills in that kind of way. He recorded these people. He published them. The instrumentation kept expanding. With Jimmie Rodgers alone, he tried orchestras. He tried horn sections in jazz bands. He tried Hawaiian musicians. He recorded him with black blues musicians. All these things. Was it because, Pierre loved the experiment of trying this, he wanted to be a chemist when he was a kid. He would try 1 + 1, see if it explodes. So he would try things, and if they worked, we did it again. That basically is what a genre is. It's what country music as a genre is. You try this kind of approach for this kind of audience. You have to identify who this is for. And the way they're presented takes that in mind, which is why, in the earliest days, they dropped newspaper articles about Fiddler John Carson. The second session was in New York. It wasn't on the road because you could record them better in the studio. And they Pierre got out newspaper articles saying how uncomfortable he was in New York City with all these big people. So they were doing that, which is often nonsense, but absolutely necessary for marketing. I mean, country music people were still, Patsy Cline and Ernest Tubb singing at even Buck Owens singing at Carnegie Hall in the 60s. And you got to do, I'm amazed that all these New York people like this music as if they didn't know. I mean, this is still, it's a thing. It's the way you sell country music. We don't know nothing about, it's like, and these are pretty hip people who do that. And they were then. So where does country music came from? It's from finding the right artist with the right, like Merle Haggard said, the right attitude and the right pulse for the country audience. Ernest Tubb always said that. He said, they asked him, why is Jimmie Rodgers the father of country music and not Vernon Dalhart, which people thought maybe it was him? He said, because Vernon Dalhart sang all kinds of music for anybody, and he was this opera singer, and he wasn't committed to it. But Jimmie Rodgers said, that's what I do, that's what I'm for. He sang in hundreds of towns, not any one kind of what they came to call country music. I mean, he didn't put it under a thing. He was sold as a kind of Southern vaudeville singer who sang to those people, that audience with this yodel thing in his day. And eventually they stuck a name on what that thing was. But his records were often sold as pop, not as old-time favorites is what they were calling, old-time country. Even the Carters were even sold that way. He was sold as pop. And over time, they said it was country music. So if you ask where the country music you're still listening and care about comes from, that's the shortest version I can give you. They're still finding it. They say, but what's this music they play now have to do with country music? I promise you, in the 30s, when Bob Wills was playing jazz and they were going at country music, they said, what's that got to do with the Carter family? And when Ernest Tubb started to sing songs about getting drunk in bars and running and committing adultery, they said, what does that honky-tonk have to do with country music? Every version of this, rockabilly, what's that got to do with country music? When they started to cross it with soul music in the 70s, and you couldn't tell the R&B apart from the country, what does that got to do? I tell you what, the line I always say is, country music is not what it used to be, and it never was.